like we are live. Welcome everyone to this, our fifth week of office hours on the book of James. It is Wednesday night, but you might be watching it on Thursday morning or late Saturday night, or who knows, but we are glad that you're watching with us whenever it is that you're watching with us. We are wrapping up our study of James tonight with the fifth chapter, and excited to be here. And my name, for those of you that don't remember from last week, is Chris Holmes, and I am the scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I am joined this evening by Dr. Brennan Breed, who's an associate professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, and our guest host this evening is also a professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, Dr. Raj Nadella. And so we're really strong on Columbia Seminary tonight. And, you know, if you guys have a little private language that you use and, you know, want to make me feel even more left out, that's cool. I get it. But Raj, we're so glad that you are here. And we're glad for those of you that are joining us to conclude our study of James tonight as well.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Raj, thanks so much. And Raj and I go way back. We both started at the same time at Columbia Theological Seminary about 9 years ago now, which is amazing to hear. But Raj, it's been such a pleasure to be your colleague at Columbia Seminary, and it's been so cool to learn from you in so many different ways. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom with everyone who's joining us here tonight. So thank you so much. Hey, let me first ask. Usually we start by asking our guests a pretty simple question, but one that usually brings up a lot of important, I think, issues. But that question is, what kind of hermeneutical lenses do you bring to the text? So, what sort of ways of reading do you tend to bring to your own interpretation? Again, thank you so much for joining us, Raj.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Brennan. I would say that the first hermeneutical lens that I bring, and this will come as no surprise to you two, is the postcolonial lens. And what that means is there is a presupposition that much of the Bible, especially pretty much all the New Testament books, were written from the margins, but also on behalf of the margins, from the perspective of the marginalized groups, but also on behalf of the marginalized groups. I also bring my background as an immigrant to biblical texts, and there are a lot of stories in the Bible that are about displacement and migration. To add to that, I would say a theological presupposition that goes with this postcolonial hermeneutic is that not only that God is busy transforming the world, but also that people are invited to participate in that transformative work that God has been facilitating. One of the texts that I often talk about is the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. In many of them, there is a passive voice that is used. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger, for they will be fed. So who is it that will comfort them? And who is it that will feed them? And why is it in the passive voice? A lot of people say it's divine passive. God is at work. Certainly, but God is also inviting humans to participate in the transformative work. And really quickly, the Beatitudes come immediately after Jesus called his first disciples. And that sheds light on the fact that the disciples are invited to participate in this transformative work. So that's a theological presupposition that I bring to biblical text.
Thank you, Raj. And one thing we usually also ask is what's something you're working on now, and it could be any kind of thing, but also if you have a chance to explain a little bit more about postcolonial theory, just in case anyone here hasn't really dug into that yet, if you're going to share with us about your work on the Gospels and postcolonial theory, that would be super helpful too. But in any event, whatever you want to share would be great.
Yeah. So a couple of exciting projects that I'm working on. One, I am co-editing a volume called Christianity and the Law of Migration. You may recall that last year we hosted a conference called Migration and Border Crossings. So Silas Allard at Emory, Christian Hire at Boston College, and myself, we brought together 14 scholars, 7 theologians, biblical scholars, 7 legal scholars, and all of them are contributing to this volume with Routledge. Second, I am co-authoring a textbook on postcolonial biblical criticism with Steve Davidson at McCormick Theological Seminary. So both these books will come out sometime next year.
Thank you, Raj.
It's going to be that's a big year for you. Lots of, signings to do, I'm sure. And, you'll probably get a couple big shipments of boxes that are yours to give away freely, or, decorate. I always like when professors decorate their entryway with, like right when you walk into their house, the first thing you see is 1,000 copies of their commentary. It's awesome. So I think that would be great.
Chris, I'm actually more optimistic about especially about this postcolonial textbook. The book is aimed at college students and seminary students. Yeah. So my hope is that all the college students in this country will buy it, and I can retire early.
Yes, good call. I think that's our dream, all of us. Yes. Yeah.
No, but I've heard mention of this work that you're working on, the co-authored book, and it does seem to be going to be a definitive work in terms of providing a comprehensive but accessible introduction to post-colonial biblical interpretation of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Right. And so, seminarians should buy it. Interested lay people should buy it, and it should be required reading for all college students. You're right.
That's right. And by the way, Steve is a great person too, so that must be cool to work with him. I've enjoyed meeting him at conferences and things. So that's great. Wonderful. Well, Raj, we have a lot to talk about tonight when it comes to the book of James too. So I hope you don't mind if we start to venture in. We ended last time with chapter 4 with this discussion with the merchants and telling them that they should maybe give more credence to God in terms of their plans for the future and so on. But then we come to this shift in chapter 5, a shift that really seems to be kind of angry, upset, right? There's some harsh words and harsh motivations and language here in James chapter 5, especially at the beginning here, verses 1 through 6. What do you do with these opening verses, and maybe why are they so angry, and who are they really directed at?
Oh, I think the text that you just talked about, the first part of chapter 5, is directed primarily at the ultra-rich. But James is not talking to the ultra-rich in the society out there. The letter is actually addressed inward. So this is to the wealthy people who are part of the church, perhaps the wealthy Roman officials who decided to join Christian congregations for whatever reason. They were probably the God-fearers who decided to become part of the Christian community. Obviously James is really angry with this group, and I think for a variety of reasons. But for want of time, quickly, I will name 3 reasons. One, obviously, the trajectory in which the ultra-rich are traveling in this community is inconsistent with many of the New Testament traditions about Jesus or John the Baptist. I would even say Paul. Many people talk about Paul as being in opposition to James. That is actually incorrect, because even though Paul talks about justification by faith a lot, he actually was very intentional about promoting economic justice. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, but also Paul was raising money for the poor, and there are other examples. So the ultra-rich in James's community have adopted ways that are inconsistent with the New Testament traditions. Second, ecclesia, which was the word that was used to refer to Christian community, was all about adapting an ethos that was at odds with the ethos of the rest of the society. Ecclesia, called out community, right? You're called out, not so much spatially, but morally. And if you're morally separating yourself as the church, what the ultra-rich are doing here is mimicking what the society is doing out there. That's the second problem. The third problem is the trajectory adopted by the rich, which is not paying the poor people, the workers, their wages, for instance. It's not sustainable, not just for the poor, but it's also unsustainable for the rich as well. That is, if the rich continue to accumulate wealth at the expense of the poor people, and the poor are not even getting paid the wages that they have earned, and they have no money to buy, the rich can't sell their goods anymore. I mean, their business can't function anymore. They need customers, right? But also, if I were a rich person, I need to ask myself, and I'm going to borrow an insight from Walter Brueggemann here. I need to ask myself this question: do I want to spend all my energy oppressing my poor neighbors and turn them into my enemies? Or do I want to act fairly and turn them into neighbors that I can play with, that I can hang out with? So what the rich are doing here is not just selfish, but also utterly unwise. It is to their own detriments in the long run.
Yeah. I think I mentioned this earlier in our study, but what you just said, that Brueggemann sort of insight, reminded me again of the parable of the shrewd the shrewd manager who essentially like cooks the books, right, so that he'll have a place to live, and a community. And in some ways, that's what you're saying, that you can use your wealth to create community, to not just create customers or dependents, but to create genuine neighbors that you can be in relationship with. Or if you continue to practice it in this way, you'll end up with enemies, and perhaps dangers that come with that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And Luke 16, the parable you mentioned, is a great example, Chris. Because if a lot of people were unable to repay their loans, it was probably because they were charged exorbitant interest rates in the first place. And so the manager is saying, let's settle these accounts in a fair manner.
And of course, this is one of those places when reading ancient scripture that has no resonance with our contemporary society, right? Like this is one of those places we can easily get off the hook and say, man, that's such a different world than the world we live in. I love that you described this. I mean, whether or not we talk about the ultra rich in our own faith communities, we certainly can talk about the ultra rich. I love that language that you used, because I'm sure many of the people viewing this have seen that in the pandemic, the billionaires, the billionaires, their net worth has just increased.
Oh, yeah.
And so while there is economic turmoil and travail for those in the lower classes, those at the very, 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 very top are doing quite well for themselves.
Yeah, the 0.1% have gained 40 billion since the COVID started in the United States. Yeah.
Wow. So you probably read Timothy Noah's book, The Great Divergence. He talks about how in the 1980s, the 1% were taking home 9% of all the personal income. But in 2015, they were taking home 25% of all the personal income in the US. Mm-hmm. And that has only gone up in the last few years, Brennan. Yes.
And we can say globally too that the United States has an outsized share of global income and wealth and share of resources and things like this. And so, yeah, if we think about just an individual, I might be like, well, I'm not wasting that much money, right? But then I look at my role in my US ecosystem and look at my role within the global ecosystem compared to others as well. And I can see myself being culpable of these things as well.
Yeah. And again, one of the things that is in this passage, and you sort of mentioned earlier, is this language of unjust labor practices. In these verses, we get this idea of the way you've withheld or you've stolen, even you've sort of held back the wages of those who mow your fields. and the harvesters are crying out, and who do they cry out to? They cry out to this God of the hosts, this Lord of the hosts, and here we see this perspective that we've seen elsewhere in James, that God is really championing the cause of the poor, and again, this feels like so contemporary when we think about justice, just economic practices. And we talk about fair wages, and we talk about, having an awareness as consumers about maybe where we purchase things, and how those employees are treated, and so forth. This seems to be a text that speaks quite directly to the need as Christians to discern those labor practices.
Right. And especially, I think this is a call to people in the church who have power and influence. Are they mimicking the structures and the ethos of the society out there? Or are they setting up and establishing a parallel structure, an ethos that is at odds with what is in society out there? I think James is really mad with the rich people in his own church.
And to say so I'm an Old Testament guy. So I hear about this stuff about the anger of God a lot. And the way I usually hear it as an Old Testament person is someone says, well, there's the angry God of the Old Testament, and then there's the nice God of the New Testament, and Jesus is nice, etc. When I read James, I hear about this judgment here, and this might be something people just skip over. A lot of Christians want to skip over this kind of language. It's too, intense or judgy, etc. And of course, there's bad ways that Christians can judge. But when I read this about clothes being moth-eaten and riches rusting, I hear Jesus and the idea that your treasure is where your heart is. And so, this sounds a lot like, and Jesus got really mad and judged people too. But I from where I sit, the key to all this is that God does get mad and judge things, and that if we pretend like God is just nice, we are avoiding a central aspect of not only God but of how justice works. That when I read this too, the people who are mowing your land, really, I think of people harvesting crops and things. That's the Hebrew slaves. I look at Exodus and I'm like, Pharaoh's not going to give up the system because Pharaoh's getting too much stuff, extracting too much stuff out of it. Pharaoh's not going to give up. And Pharaoh's got lots of chances. He's hurt. He knows the pain of the people. He's going to pretend he doesn't know. But it's going to take God actually getting involved and knocking some stuff down, destroying some things that's going to be painful to Pharaoh in order to deconstruct this system, because there's no freedom without it. There's no liberation without it, and no freedom from oppression without it, because that's so in other words, God gets mad. And so does that make sense to New Testament folk too?
Absolutely. And Brennan, that's a really great point. The suggestion that the Old Testament God is angry, the New Testament God is more loving, is one, supersessionist, it's anti-Semitic, I think, and two, it's just not true. What about Jesus turning the tables at the temple? Is that an extra canonical text? I thought I saw it in the gospel somewhere.
It's in a couple of them, yeah.
Right. And there is John the Baptist, who is turning to the ultra-rich and calling them brood of vipers for abusing the poor people. Yeah. And then there is Revelation chapter 18, which is an indictment against the people in power. And here is James. These are just 4 examples in the New Testament.
God gets really mad in Exodus and wants to, get mad at things, but it's also salvation and liberation. It depends on which side of the coin you're on though, right? Isn't that it's freedom and liberation to one. And so I hear the prophets too in here too, that word cry out, which occurs a couple times. It's 2 different Greek words, I think, but both of them are used to translate this Hebrew word in the Greek versions of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And I think they're echoed here, but that in Hebrew, that verb is sa'ak, which is Abel's blood cries out from the ground, which I hear echoed here in this text. That you condemned and murdered a righteous one in verse 6 here. Sounds a lot like Abel's blood, and it's crying out, the cries of the harvesters crying out from the ground, and so on. It makes me sound think of that. But also this makes me think of the Old Testament law. This is a shocking text in Exodus, but one that I love because it makes me feel uncomfortable. but in a way that I think is important. But so in Exodus 22, this is part of the law, like the law code itself.
Right.
So Exodus 22:21, it says, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." And I love that God chooses these people because God can say to them, "You didn't deserve this. You didn't do any of this yourself. I liberated you so that you can remember that position, so that you can then seek to liberate others in that same position," right? But then, "You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them when they cry out to me," and that's that same word we see in James, in Hebrew tza'ak, in Greek boule. This, if they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and God says, I will come kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children's orphans. I mean, there's a lot of violence there, which has its own problems. But that in the Old Testament, the idea there is that God is the defender, the goel, the redeemer, the avenger of the orphan and the widow. They have no one to protect them in a dangerous place and time, but God vows to be the one who will defend them. And so I see that here, that God is kind of acting as like the defender of these vulnerable people. And I see this as being just taken straight out of the law, kind of like James 1:27, that like, this is what pure religion is, to love and help the widows and the orphans. Does that to New Testament people, does that through line kind of work, or do you see this connecting to kind of the law in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what James is getting at is the identity of the community as Christians goes back to the memory that you are talking about, Exodus and other parts of the Old Testament. God liberated the people from situations of oppression. Mm-hmm. And when people forget that history and replicate the same structures, they are turning their backs on their own history, on God, on poor people as well, but they're turning their backs on their own history.
Yeah, they become Pharaoh in a way, and we know what Pharaoh does, right? Or what God does to Pharaoh in a way. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the David and Solomon story, it seems to me like David and Solomon both get painted by the biblical authors as people who turn into Pharaoh and then need to be deconstructed in that way. But also the prophets keep calling that out. I mean, I hear Micah bouncing around in my head about this anger at how the rich have consumed the people who they're supposed to be looking out for, that is the poor and vulnerable in the community. That's kind of central to the covenant. But yeah, that the cry, God is especially if it's, and of course the idea of this preferential option for the poor, that God hears those cries more than God hears the cries of others who don't need God's help as much, which I just find that to be kind of amazing. Yeah.
Elsa Tamas talks about the preferential option for the poor quite a bit in her commentary on James.
Yeah.
Chris, I think wanted.
Well, so I was sorry. I had to mute myself for a second because my dogs were here. Last week we had a fire alarm. This week my dogs were concerned because they could see the neighbor that they've seen a million times. But I was wondering about the ending of this first part of James 5, around verses 5 and 6, and it's a series of verbs that appear in the sort of same tense with the same sort of sense, where it says you've lived a life of self-indulgence, you've lived luxuriously, you've fed your hearts in the day of slaughter, you've condemned and you've murdered the righteous one who didn't resist you. And I think one of the dangers, and this is probably my own projection, so deal with me, enter into the analyst space with me. It's easy to say, well, okay, I'm not a top 1%. I'm not an ultra rich. And if I'm honest, the life that I live is luxurious in comparison to a lot of people. And so, I think about a student that might walk into either of your offices with a question of like, how do I read this text? Without, or do I read this text like some of the church fathers who said, I'm done with it. You can take my inheritance. I'm going to go live in the desert. How do we determine, is it a matter of determining if we're at fault in this verse? And is there a standard or a framework or hermeneutic for us to think through these verses, which are sharp and can easily apply to anyone in the top third of the wealth world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris, and your observation too, that that while we might not be part of the 1%, we still have privilege as well. I think the way I would read that part of chapter 5 is one, I would ask myself, how am I relating to the people who do not have the kind of privilege that I have? If I am not treating them fairly, my own critique of the ultra rich is hypocrisy, and perhaps more. So I ask myself the question of how am I paying the people who mow my lawn? Am I trying to pay them the minimum amount possible, or am I being generous, right? But also, on the other side of it, the question for me is, how am I participating in oppressive economic structures that are perpetuated by the top 1%? Because I feel like those of us who have this kind of education, this kind of privilege, we are often invited to participate in oppressive economic structures, and on some level, deflect attention from those oppressive economic structures. I'll give you really one quick example. 4 or 5 years ago, I was invited to participate in a roundtable conference in Chicago about economic justice. And very interestingly, we were put up in this really fancy 5-star hotel, wined and dined. And then, as it turned out, that roundtable was actually sponsored by a wealthy corporation. And so what do? Do we go there and talk about everything but not call attention to the oppressive practices of this corporation? Or do we say, now that I have this space available to me, I actually have to call attention to what is happening?
Yeah. Brennan, anything to add there before we move to the next part of James 5?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really strong connection there with Deuteronomy 24 verses 14, 15. That's mentioned in some of the study notes and in the Batten article. But I think it's so key that like God cares about labor and wages, and it's not that God wants everyone to be destitute, that that's some sort of good thing, but like it's a communal ethos of the covenant that God wants people to be flourishing. And if I am taking extra things I don't need from the community and keeping other people from flourishing, then that's getting in the way of God's vision for the world. I mean, it's just as simple as that, it seems. But I love the way that James is kind of tying that together with all these other themes that he's got about, there's some kind of personal, like we need to take account of this ourselves, but also there's this, it's a covenantal communal ethos at the core that Raj is pointing out, and that this is structural, right? I mean, we are in some way responsible for the structures we are a part of. We can't change everything ourselves, but we can try. But I love how too that this syncs up so clearly with all of the Old Testament prophets. I mean, the Old Testament prophets are just hard to read. It's hard to know what Jeremiah is talking about. I'll be honest. But if you want to know what Jeremiah is talking about, you go read Jeremiah 7, where he preaches at the temple and he very clearly says what he's mad about. And what he's mad about is that you aren't following the covenant because you're not taking care of the orphans and widows. He says that. I mean, if you want to hear what Amos is mad about the fact that there are certain people living in luxury, and they have structured the situation so that they can take the land and take the inheritance of the land from all these other people, which God has distributed evenly amongst the tribes. If you want to hear what Micah is mad about, I mean, there's some parts of Micah that are kind of vague, but there's certain parts where he just comes out and says it. Hey, there are some rich people who are plotting to steal land from poor people, which is their it's not just like their front yards or something. They're stealing their ability to produce for themselves and for other people. And like, we are kidding ourselves if we don't think that this is the way things are set up in our. I mean, it is harder to make rent today than at any other time since I've been alive, right? Like for the average American, it's harder to make rent right now. I mean, because of many forces, right? But right now, the COVID being one of them. But, we haven't set up our society to take care of the poor and the orphans and the widows. And one last little bit here, which I love, is that, ancient Israel kind of makes up the category of poverty. in the sense that poverty as something bad that you shouldn't be in, right? I mean, like ancient Mesopotamians, they got poor people, but they're farmers. They're laborers. Like they're supposed to be like that. They're not supposed to get out of it. It's not a condition, right? It's like that. The gods made you like that so that I could be at the top. And what's revolutionary about ancient Israelite religion is they say God wants us to actually all have access to the land. God doesn't want this kind of structure to our society, and God destroys it like Pharaoh, and then says, "Don't build this anymore." And then they build it just like that, and God knocks it down again, and that's the kings getting thrown out and so on. So when I see James here, I see this vision of an alternate possibility, an alternate reality that Raj is pointing out too, and just we're at a crisis moment right now, but also a moment where it's possible, it's within the realm of possibility to reevaluate some of our economic structures. I just really hope we take advantage of that.
Great point, Brennan. And to add to that, to build upon what you said, I would say Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes, also envision an alternative reality. Here is Jesus, who is announcing the launch of the kingdom, announcing the inauguration of a new community. And the Beatitudes are all about the ethos by which the new community would be guided. It's about how people take care of each other, how the poor will be fed, how the people who cry will be comforted, and so on. And so, the covenant that you talked about in the Old Testament is actually, Jesus returns to it in Matthew's gospel.
I think the only thing I want to add, just as a sort of a connection with what you both are saying, particularly the reminder about this being in a covenant community, that one of the things that I've struggled with, as an adult, is that we have a very anonymous understanding of poverty, and because of the ways in which poverty is, there are pockets of poverty. And or we think about folks that are on highway exits with their signs, and that one of the things that I think is true of the early Christian community, certainly true of the people of Israel, was that there wasn't as much anonymity. You knew the people who were impoverished, and you were in relationship with them, and something has happened that we are able to live and with so much more distance between us and those who are impoverished. And so I think one of the challenges of your guys' discussion about this part of James chapter 5 is to find ways to go against that, so that poverty isn't just some amorphous, anonymous thing, but it is, we put names and faces and stories and situations to the rent, the inability to pay rent, the inability to find a well-paying job, and that we then welcome them into our communities somehow, or we make sure that the community, that we're the called out community that we're a part of, is taking care of them. I like that. All right, so there's kind of, just like the text has this abrupt shift, we can sort of shift abruptly to James 5, 7 through 11, which is, addresses now almost, it seems like, a different part of the audience. If 1 through 6 is about the ultra rich in the community, verse 7 seems to be about everyone. Beloved is the way the NRSV translates it. It's, brothers and sisters might be another way to translate it. And so we get this turn to the siblings and about the need for patience and endurance. And I think one of the things that caught my attention very early is this phrase, until the coming of the Lord.
Right.
And we read this in the year 2020.
It might be the year. Who knows?
It could be. No,
it's starting off the right way.
there is this perennial speculation about the second coming of Jesus. It was very strong, as far as we know, among early Christians like Paul. Paul kind of thought that it was going to happen in his lifetime. There were people in the Middle Ages who thought it was definitely going to happen in their time. And we've had recent, predictions by Harold Camping and others that have given us the day and time when Jesus was going to come back. And so I think my first question is that what James is talking about at all when we have the coming of the Lord, or what are we to do with this in 1950 years later?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. I read that particular part of chapter 5 several times because it's a bit of a puzzle. I think at the outset, you named it, which is a lot of people in that particular context had this expectation of imminent parousia. We cannot question that. But we can't interpret the term we can't take the term the day of the Lord literally as if it was referring only to parousia. The day of the Lord was also referring to this motif of the arrival of the kingdom of God, which was already set in motion and was being realized on a regular basis. And it's within that context that James is calling for patience or endurance. I think those are the words that are used there. But if we look at the Greek word that is used there, it is hupomone. Hupomone can be translated as patience, in which case someone might say James is just asking people to hang tight till Jesus comes with all his power and might. That's one way of looking at it. But hupomone also refers to endurance, surviving. It refers to persisting, perseverance. So I don't think James is saying that, I don't think James is calling people to passively wait for Jesus to come and fix the society. I think James is actually, one, suggesting that the kingdom of God is going to be realized, and two, more importantly, he's asking them to persevere, persist. And that's more active than just sitting around and waiting for something to happen. Yeah. And in that same section, there is a reference to prayer, if I recall correctly. Is it in the same section or next to it?
So there is a section about prayer.
Okay, we'll come to that later. We
a little bit later.
Starting 13, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we'll come to that.
Yeah. There's even the question about, and your guys' colleague Martha Morkish raises this, I think, well in her commentary, about whether or not the Lord here refers to Jesus or to God. And of course, in the New Testament, the word kurios can apply to both the God of Israel as well as to Jesus. And so I think the way that she reads it is, and I think you sort of voiced this as well, this is more about the coming day of the Lord, the day when God will in fact right the scales, when God will set things right. And that then if we're to hear this, waiting on that to happen and working for that to happen is really hard work. And that's why you need hupomone. That's why you need endurance. That's why you need to stand the line. This is, I think of hupomone as originally a military term. It is what, generals say to their soldiers: hold the line, don't let go. We're about to win. And so in that way, that's the same sort of motivation, that the end is always just 1 second in front of us. And what you need is the ability to hold on just a little bit more to keep working.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of my favorite words in the New Testament, but often mistranslated, I should say.
Yes. Yeah. We just finished a study of Job, Brennan, if you don't remember.
Yes.
I know.
Yeah. Who remembers that? A month ago. A month ago is like 7 years ago, COVID time.
COVID time, it was 7 years ago. But here, in this exhortation to sort of like hold fast, like, gird the loins and get through it. We have this reference to the prophets, and especially the prophet Job. And as our resident Old Testament scholar for tonight, I wonder if you could speak definitively about every possible interpretation of this verse.
Well, I won't speak definitively, but I can go off on it for a while. I'll shorten it. I'll give you the short version. But the first thing is, if I'm reading this as an Old Testament professor and I see like the coming of kind of the day of the Lord right after you're talking about a prophetic judgment of riches and so on, I'm thinking Amos, right? Or like the prophet Micah, or like the prophet Jeremiah, who are calling for the day of the Lord when the judge, used here in verse 9, the judge is going to come. That sounds to me like Pharaoh's going down, or the kings of Judah who have become Pharaoh, to, in the words of Jeremiah, they're going to come down. But then you bring up Job. It's almost like, the record scratch. I hear a record scratch and I'm like, the prophet Job, Job's not a prophet really, but he sees God, which is what James is really talking about. But the best that biblical scholars can do here is to say either James doesn't really know Job very well, because Job is not patient except for the first 2 chapters. He's very patient in the first 2 chapters, and then he gets incredibly impatient, right, as we saw in our study. That's a possibility, I guess, that James doesn't really know what he's talking about. But I think instead, there are scholars, in one of the articles that, Chris, you put on the syllabus, thanks for doing that, but there are several scholars who have pointed out that this is probably referring to another version of the story of Job called the Testament of Job, that seems to have been very popular, not only in Jewish, it came out of a Jewish tradition at some time right around the time of Jesus, but it became actually more popular than the book of Job, even in Christian tradition for a while. And it was Pope Gregory, like in, early 6th century Pope Gregory, who had to say, like, you got to stop reading this book because it's not biblical. But it continues. If you've ever seen paintings of Job, like picking at his sores, or Job getting paid, like, are there musicians near Job playing music or something? These are kind of popular traditions, even in medieval and early modern European painting with Job. Those aren't in the book of Job at all. They refer to this kind of still alive bundle of legends that come from Job, in which he is perfectly enduring, that he never says anything mean or mad about God. He never questions his condition. So it's a very different line of tradition about who Job is and what he did than we get in the biblical story of Job. And this is just a little shred of what we know from these New Testament authors, that they had access to all kinds of texts that weren't they didn't just have the Old Testament. They had all kinds of stuff that we don't, so much we don't have access to today, but we can see, like in the letter of Jude, there's like the assumption of Moses is referred to, and
Enoch is in there.
Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that was contemporary and current and understood to be scripture in some way. So this is probably referring to that. And in that alternate story of Job, Job is purely patient. He is a symbol of patience, and he endures all trials and never asks any questions. And that seems to be what James is picking up on and giving us here. So another way to think about it is like, another biblical person who suffers and gets through it and comes out on the other end okay. Daniel, let's say, the endurance of Daniel, or the endurance of Esther, or the endurance of Ruth. Those are things we can kind of, instead, if we're asking questions about Job, but he's looking for a well-known tradition, I think, to be able to kind of be his point, which is exactly what I think what Raj was saying. Hold on in the midst of all of this, and stand firm. Don't give up the game in the last day, as you said, Chris.
Right.
I don't know if that's right, but I mean, that seems right.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, Martha in her commentary talks about it, and the context actually of the Testament of Job, which I'll be honest, I haven't read, or if I have, I haven't.
It's pretty crazy, man. There's magic belts. There's it's a pretty incredible read. You can just Google it and read it. By the way, Testament of Job. Yeah. Definitely take a look at it. It's pretty intense.
Well, and she points out that the whole premise of suffering there is because Job wants to destroy some pagan idols,
right?
And an angel warns him, "Hey, if you do that, Satan is going to come and make you suffer," which sort of solves the whole theological problem that we had with Job.
Why is Satan mad at him? Yeah, right. And of course they read it as Satan and the devil, and not a divine attorney in a way. Yeah, so that's all the background, but also that comes from a rabbinic legend of Abraham, or even pre-rabbinic. That's a Second Temple Jewish tradition about Abraham, that Abraham knocked over some idols, and then kind of that becomes kind of gets grafted onto the Job legend, which is an interesting. I mean, so just to say these legends are in flux, they're live, they're mainly oral at this point in time, probably, or at least maybe not mainly oral, but they're kind of moving between texts and between them pretty freely at this point in time. But in any event, yeah.
I was going to say, just as an aside, like as an asterisk, if it's not clear to those that are watching, this just shows so clearly how the notions of authoritative biblical or para-biblical texts were very much sort of fluid in this period, that James seems to be referring to a tradition that is extra-biblical. Jude is referring to some traditions that are extra-biblical, and yet is doing so in a way that says, these are authorities. Like, these aren't just like, my buddy down the street told me, these are as close to quotations as we could get without a quotation. These are allusions, but they assume a sort of authority that really sort of blows up the process of canonization as being really, it was all set on this day and everything else was wrong. It gives us a witness into something that's much more fluid or migrant, right, Brennan?
Yeah. It is a constantly shifting tradition, and it still is today. Let's be honest. I mean, we revisit these scriptural texts, and they're going to speak to us a little differently tomorrow than they're speaking to us today, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. It means God's alive. It means the Spirit's moving. So all to say, we're dealing here with kind of the multivalence or the multiple levels of tradition. And to borrow a phrase from Raj from his work Dialogue, Not Dogma, about the Gospel of Luke, but nonetheless, here we can say that there's a kind of interplay or a dialogue between these different parts of the tradition, in which there is a bit of dissonance, but that's okay. God works at that too. We hope. But maybe we should, just in the light of time, maybe we should shift to verses 12 through 20. Chris, in your kind of preparatory notes, you put these all together as like the church's work. Like, this is the communal work that we're not supposed to swear oaths. That's an interesting part of this. But there's this bit about suffering and prayer and healing and what the elders are supposed to do. So we're getting a little bit more language about the church community, the community of the ecclesia, this community that's been called out to do God's work alongside God in the world, of healing and of economic justice and all sorts of things. Then we get this little mention of Elijah and rain, which seems interesting. And then we finish with this very abrupt ending, right? The letter ends in a way that no other ancient Greek letter that I'm aware of ends. There's no salutate. There's no kind of, hey, tell all these people hi and all these things. But it just ends very abruptly with this call to repentance, it seems, right? You need to change. And, no one's condemned yet, right? But the end's coming soon. You better change. So what do we do with this last section? And Raj, how do we how do we relate this to what comes before, but also how do we understand this to be kind of a conclusion of James? How does it work?
Yeah, you're talking about 19 and 20?
Well, I mean, the whole this kind of last section we can say, right?
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the word prayer.
Yeah.
Because it's a deeply loaded term, especially in our context. If there is injustice, or if there is gun violence, and there are people who are saying thoughts and prayers, really? I mean, what do we make of that? That James is actually asking people to pray. I think that in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels, but also in James, prayer takes on a very different meaning. The Lord's Prayer, for instance, Jesus is praying and asking actively that the kingdom of God become a reality. So it's not passive, but it's very, very active. I think James would have a lot of problem with people who would pray in such ways that prayer would become a substitute for action.
Right.
You would want people to pray in such ways that prayer would become a catalyst for change rather than a substitute for change. And I think that also goes back to this whole binary of faith and action. James would want people to envision faith in such a way that it would ultimately lead to good works, not to become a substitute for good works. But of course, people have misinterpreted this part of James repeatedly.
I feel like people have misinterpreted a lot of James repeatedly.
Oh yeah, right. Oh yeah.
I mean, I just mean it seems to be a theme of the book, actually, is that it says some hard things that people don't want to hear. So they kind of hear it the way they want to hear it, and then they do away with it, or they just ignore it.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think I love it. I typed it in Facebook. This idea is prayer as a catalyst for change, not as a substitute for change, or for action. I think probably the other end of the spectrum is, that like more of a mechanistic understanding of prayer. Like if we, and even the example of Elijah here, sort of suggests this. Elijah was such a holy person, or he had such a close relationship with God, or he knew the right words, that he kind of was able to perform this magic trick in front of all of the other prophets of Baal, and closed up heaven for a couple of days and then opened up heaven for a couple of days. And so to what degree does this sort of suggest that there's a mechanism for getting God to do what we want through prayer, versus the other end of the spectrum, Raj, that you've highlighted of, sort of I pray, which means I don't have to do anything at all? Does that make sense?
Right. No, I think, but just, it might be somewhere in the middle, actually. I think that James would want people to pray in such a way that prayer becomes an opportunity for them to envision a different reality, an alternative community. So yeah, James is definitely talking about an agency that is beyond divine agency. He's not negating divine agency, it's very much there, but he wants the human agency in addition to the divine agency there. Prayer then becomes an opportunity for people to envision their own agency in terms of bringing about transformation.
I like that.
Yeah, and I mean, from coming from an Old Testament perspective, and especially with the mention of Elijah in verse 17, I see the story of Elijah holding back the rain and so on to be intimately related to the question of healing, because Elijah heals the young boy not long after that, and it happens to be a widow's son, a poor person, a person who has no economic possibility. And it seems to me like in the Old Testament, if you ask someone, are you healthy or are you well, you use the word shalom, which means peace, but it means like, well, everything, right? Like, is everything okay? And sickness is any part of that. The economic system is if it's disrupted, it's sick. If widows and orphans are being taken advantage of, if people aren't being paid, that's a sickness. But also, the rain, even ecological issues can be part of this kind of sickness, right? And peace or wellness means all of those things being in some way coherent and unified and leading to the flourishing of life. And so the idea of Elijah's prayer over nature, which is supposed to in some way dispel the powers of Baal and Ahab and Jezebel, the kind of wicked, those who are leading Israel towards oppression, that there's this kind of movement in the other direction by taking care of orphans and widows and healing them, but as a part of this much larger thing. And it's not isolated. And so with COVID, it can feel so isolated in some ways. Someone died from COVID, but it's a part of a much larger network, as we see, right? Like it's tied to access to public health, or it's where are the good hospitals, and what are people's healthy conditions right now, and is that related to the land they're living in? Is it related to their access to food? Is it related to their kinds of jobs they have? All this stuff is integrated and holistic instead of being fragmented like we like to think about it. But I don't know if James is actually going there, but I mean, when I see those pieces, kind of Elijah and kind of wellness, and then coming right after economic conversations about economic justice, and coming right after discussion about the prophets, I see that kind of all coming together, and James saying it's a coherent thing. But so the health of individuals, I don't know, in the Jesus miracle stories, that they seem to be kind of not purely symbolic, or maybe symbolic is the word I'm looking for, but they seem to, like, Jesus didn't heal everyone. And Jesus even says Elijah didn't heal everyone, right? Elijah only healed some people, but because they were symbolic those healings were symbolic of God's power to change things and bring life and healing, but also it was like to spur people on, right? Like Jesus healed some people in order to say, hey, this is what we're all about. Mm-hmm. Now you go do this, right? This is a part of your work. Does that make sense? I mean, is that, do you all see that stuff kind of hanging together in James?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And Brennan, if you're looking at the miracles of Jesus, when Jesus heals this person who in John's gospel, who is sitting by the pool of Bethsaida, and he couldn't get into the pool, right, when the angel disturbs the water. Because so on one level, you can say Jesus healed this person. It was an act of grace, an act of charity. But on a different level, the story also calls attention to some of the structural problems there, which is, why is it that some people had their relatives, some people had connections who could take them into the well when the time was right, but there were people like this particular person who had no connections at all. Right. He had no networks that could help him at the right time. And so a lot of Jesus's miracles don't just happen on an individual level. They also call attention to structural deficiencies there. Yeah. It's as if Jesus is saying, I know you have no connections, but I am there for you. I will take you into the
Wow.
I love that. I love that. I love the alternative reality that this traces for us of the church as a place of healing towards that wholeness, Brennan, that you say of shalom, all things being healed, not just emotionally, not just physically, not just economically, but all. And that's part of the vocation of the church. I love that. So Raj, before we run out of time, as Brennan suggested earlier, 19 and 20, the letter ends. And if we're reading other Greco-Roman letters at the time, they always say like, hey, say hi to my homeboy upstairs, and don't forget to say hi to mom for me. She cooked me some great cookies last week. And this doesn't have that sort of sign off. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the significance of this absence.
Yeah, so Brennan and I were talking really quickly before we went live. This isn't a typical Greco-Roman letter. This is more of a paranesis, which is exhortation. James intended it more to be a sermon, a moral exhortation that was designed to bring about transformation in the society. And so once he thinks he has made that point, he wasn't interested in any of the greetings or any of the other formalities in the letter. But one word that I wanted to call attention to really quickly. Do we have 30 seconds?
Yeah, we got a few minutes, yeah.
Okay, great, that's great. So in 1920, the author is encouraging the community to focus on people who have gone astray. I'm paraphrasing it. And then he says, bring them back, right? Bring them back. 19, I think, 519.
Yeah.
The Greek word that is used for bringing them back is epistrepso. Epistrepso has the connotation of correcting their paths, making them turn around, right? Change their ways. But it also has the connotation of restoring the wayward people back into the community. What I like about this word is James is not simply encouraging the community to challenge and admonish the people who have forgotten the ethos of compassion and the ethic of mercy and so on. He's also saying, even as you correct their ways, restore them back into the community.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important for us, because when we try to be in conversation with people we know who we think are silent about oppressive structures or even participating in oppressive structures, we need to be challenging them, but we also need to keep the focus on restoring them, which is relating to them, bringing them back into the community as much as possible, not making them mere targets of our criticism.
Yeah. Oh, Brennan, are you on mute?
I am. I just said powerful word for what we're going through right now, and potential changes that may happen in November, and all the potential danger that comes with. But there's a lot of conversation about what happens if things change. are we going to have, what kind of justice are we going to have, and what's the shape of it? And that's an open conversation right now.
Can we even have conversations with people that disagree with us? Really, I mean, I don't know. It's hard.
It is hard. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are like, "Oh, of course we can do that." But I mean, when you disagree, I mean, to me, a big problem is disagreeing about whether or not certain people count as people, or when we disagree about whether or not we're supposed to care for our neighbors. Those didn't used to. People, of course, have always found ways to not want to do those things, but it seemed like in good company, like you were supposed to at least kind of want to seem like you wanted to take care of everyone, or like wanted everyone to be happy. Seems like it's becoming more common now to just out and out say, hey, there's certain parts of our country that I just are my enemy, or certain parts of the world that are just my enemy, and I hate them and I don't want to have anything to do with them. I mean, that's tough.
That's tough. I mean, again, James is a good example here. He's angry with people who are oppressing others, but he's also saying, can we really restore them back into the community? I think that's powerful there.
It takes work and commitment to restore, but also it's possible. Yeah, maybe the first thing is to admit, right? To admit that we did wrong. So it's somebody who does that covers over a multitude of sins. So I better get to work.
Right.
I mean, it does beg for us to practice the long suffering patience of God. And it's so easy for us to say, well, I'm done with that relationship. I'm moving on. That person will never change. Yeah. And this suggests a much more intimate and a much more long-standing engagement with other people, even people who would want to separate themselves from us for whatever reason.
Coming from India, I can say that one of the many things I like about Gandhi was that he really believed that the best way to bring about transformation was to make the British part of the transformative process. He didn't write them off and say they were the oppressors. He said, I'm going to be in conversation with them and make them part of the process.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not necessarily the best example, but that's an example.
Yeah. Well, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if someone's not going to be a part of the process of their own reconciliation, then it starts with someone admitting, here's what I did. And it starts with someone saying, I want to make things better. But then it can move on from there. I mean, I appreciate that. I mean, people who are willing to enter into that process, that's the first step to actually having healing. And I think that's God's vision, is the shalom, like to have everything integrated and holistic again, and everything being part of flourishing together, instead of just, my side's going to win and triumph. That seems to be kind of the logic of the world, or the double-minded, as James puts it, right? That's the logic of the world, which James says is kind of a poisoning us slowly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All right, friends, it is 8:03. We owe our viewers, our listeners, 3 minutes of their time back. No, just joking. This has been, as always, this has been another rich conversation. Raj, thank you so much for the wisdom that you've shared, the perspectives that you've added to this text from James. We probably have more questions than we did when we started our study of James, but that's what's so fun about studying Scripture. Let me just do one quick plug, which is Brennan and I are finalizing details for our next office hours, which will be moved back to Sunday mornings. So keep a look on the Facebook group or the emails or wherever you get your information about office hours. That's coming. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. All of you joining us on Facebook and Zoom, and Raj for being with us, and Brennan, as always. Thank you.
Raj, Raj, thanks for taking your time on a Wednesday night and for away from your kids and everything. And you and I are both at the start of classes right now, so things are going crazy. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Raj. It was wonderful as always. And we'll look forward to hopefully someday we can have you back on. And Chris, thank you again for setting all this up for the James study. I'll look forward to trying to help you out back a little bit with the Ruth study. Well, I'll look forward to it so much. It'll be great. All right, Raj, Chris, see y'all.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.